So, hello, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to Matthew and Brave New Europe for organizing this, giving me the chance to present my take on the Greek crisis. Now, there's a few reasons why the Greek crisis is an important event to come back to. Amongst the most important ones is the fact that in the crisis management that was developed to deal with it introduced some quite novel elements, especially in relation to the global crisis that kicked off 2 years before in the United States, but also in relation to previous structural adjustment programs that we've had of like debt crisis in the 80s and 90s. At the same time, the social movements that emerged to counteract this austerity process also introduced certain things that were quite new at the time, but have become rather commonplace in social movements today. At the same time, the story of the Greek crisis is one of defeat, right? And we should be clear of that. And the defeat is not only related to the fact that there was heavy repression, of course, and not only related to the fact that the creditors were completely invariant in terms of like whether they would move back in their imposition of austerity, but it also had to do with the problems and contradictions and mistakes within the social movements as well. So it's quite crucial to keep an eye on both these things, the structural kind of obstacles towards achieving something, but also the contradictions of the movements themselves. Now, I've separated this talk into three threads, main threads. They cover like maybe half of the book. And I'm going to focus on the first part is going to be a very brief talk about what happened before the crisis in terms of the Eurozone. What exactly was the situation? I'm not going to go further back than that, but I'm just going to look at what was happening in the Eurozone. When the Eurozone was created, what exactly was going on in the various member states, and why did that lead to the outbreak of the crisis? Then I'm going to look at the crisis itself, how it came out in Greece, and what exactly was the official excuse of the crisis management, what were the unofficial aims. And then lastly, I'm going to look at how social movements try to react to all that. In the end, I'm going to mention a few things about the Syriza government, and if we have time, we might even talk about Brexit, but I don't know if that's going to be the case. We will see, might be part of the Q&A. Now, I've framed this talk with a lot of beautiful graphs that you won't be able to see. So I don't know exactly how it's going to work, because it's quite easier to have a graph and kind of point at things rather than just hear me explain. But not much we can do now, so I'm just going to go on and see what happens, okay? So the key moment for the creation of the Eurozone is the signing of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. And what that basically spelled out was a series of convergence targets for all member states that wanted to be part of the Eurozone. And they were basically the kind of microeconomic coordinates of that were around debt, deficit, and inflation, right? So debt levels had to be below 60%, deficit below 3%, and inflation had to be really low. The official target is something below 2% or close to 2%. Now, to achieve this convergence, all these member states, and especially Greece in this case, had to impose a number of recessionary measures, right? Like wage cuts, welfare cuts, the formalization of temporary, part-time, precarious work, and all that. And that brought down inflation quite a lot. If I had a graph, you would see it in the early 90s, the inflation in Greece was around 25%, and by the late 90s, it was close to 3%, right? So there's quite a huge kind of drop. At the same time that this was happening, you had a liberalization of the banking sector, and also a consolidation of the banking sector. And a very key thing was, in terms of the convergence that was happening, was the lowering of interest rates, which means basically borrowing costs went down for everyone that was going to be part of the EMU. Again, another beautiful graph showing that. Go on. So the interest rate convergence meant not only that it was like a necessary thing to adopt a common currency for all the member states, but it also hid all the recessionary measures that were happening. Because while people's wages and pensions and welfare was going down or stagnant or at least not rising at all, you had suddenly the option to borrow a lot of money, right? So a lot of people, although their wages were being cut, they suddenly got access to a number of like goods and services, commodities that they couldn't have had access to before. And that kind of masked the idea that their wages were remaining low or were being cut. So when we reach like the late 90s and early 2000s, and you have the actual creation of the EMU, what you observe in the first few years is a peculiar kind of structural imbalance taking place. And it's kind of counterintuitive, because what happened was that the peripheral weaker economies like Greece, Ireland, Spain, they recorded amazing growth rates, right? They had like between 4 and 6% growth rates every year. Whereas Germany, for example, had like 0 or negative growth rate until like 2003 and 4. And what's crucial to note here is that the growth that was recorded in the periphery was a direct result of a credit expansion, right? So the lowering of the interest rates was such that they were not completely converged. There were like small differences between the interest rates in Greece, for example, and in other countries. So these tiny differences could be exploited by like finance capital and banking sector, and it would translate into massive like earnings for them, especially in cases like Greece, or even Portugal and Spain. You did not have like a tradition of loans, right? People, like the banking sector in Greece was until like the late 90s, 70% public, right? And only if you were a public sector employee with some connections on top of that, you could actually get a loan. And suddenly, you know, everyone, regardless of their wage, regardless of their status, could have access to cheap money. So on top of that, what happened in Greece, for example, was that in contrast to many other Northern European countries, and because of like constant currency fluctuations in the past, you had a very high percentage of home ownership, because people prefer to like buy a house as a safe investment for the future rather than keep their money in the banks, like sparen, like they do in Germany, right? You know, here you just keep your money in the banks because there's a trust in Bundesbank and price stability and currency stability. Whereas in the South, the idea was that you cannot trust the currency, right? Only in Italy, in between 1980 and 1999, there were more than 18 devaluations of the currency, right? So that also meant that there was like the extent of home ownership in Greece, for example, was already close to 70%. And that for banks means incredible opportunities, because you can use that as collateral, right? So you had a virgin market that had no experience of loans, and you had people with loads of collateral to back up all these loans. So you had this massive expansion of credit, and that's what recorded growth in those countries. In different places, it took different forms. Like in Spain, it was more like a real estate boom, and it was more led by the private sector. In Greece, because traditionally Greece, the state always plays a very important role in the economy, the state was much more involved. But the mechanism more or less was the same. You had like core banks from Northern Europe that were massively investing money through the lower interest rates to the private and public sector in the periphery. The second point, to deal with the fact that there was like stagnant or negative growth in those countries, in like Germany, for example, a number of things were discussed, and eventually the Agenda 2010 was introduced. And that was supposed to have fixed the labor market rigidities and make Germany start recording growth again. In fact, this has been like very much challenged by people, and I think they're right, because what you see in 2003 is a massive expansion of the export sector, especially towards China. And that corresponds directly to the amount, again, I had a beautiful graph of that, but when you start seeing like how much the money invested in the periphery like accelerates, right? This is exactly at the time that the export boom is starting. And that was important from Germany's perspective, at least, because that created the illusion that this export boom towards China is going to go on forever. They had projections that were like all the way to 2050s, whatever. And that gave them the impression that Europe trade, inter-Europe trade, is not that important. And that is important in the sense that, you know, what happened to countries like Greece or Portugal did not matter as much in their heads, right? Now, at the same time, we know that there was a lot of development of, there was an increase in debt like during the so-called Eurozone golden years, right? But when we talk about debt, we have to be quite careful what we mean, because, missing graph, the majority of the debt that was increased in that time was private debt. It was not public debt, not the so-called sovereign debt, right? It was private debt. Public debt in all those countries, in the Eurozone average, remained more or less constant, right? The only exception being Greece. In fact, if you look at the countries in the periphery, with the exception of Greece, they had like debt ratios that were much lower even than Germany, right? Ireland, Spain, and Portugal had debt rates that were like lower than 60%, lower than the requirement of Maastricht. And all of that went to hell in 2007, when the crisis from the US came to Europe, and all the countries that were exposed in one way or another to these things, the governments had to step in and bail the private sector out. And again, I had a beautiful graph of that, but I'm just going to keep saying that because I see it here and it's like, okay.
Why is it not working?
Nobody knows. So Greece was different, right? With the exception of everyone else, Greece had a debt which was quite high. It was like the ratio to GDP was like close to 100%, right? Much higher than everyone else. But if you look at the period between 2000 and 2009, right? Although the actual value of the debt went up almost like 100%, it was like 100 billion and it went up to 200 billion, 200 and something actually. The ratio to the GDP remained the same, close to 100%. And the reason for that is because you had like GDP growth, right? You had low borrowing costs. So basically they just kept like borrowing money, but because the GDP was going up, that did not appear as creating a kind of a problem between the two. So the debt to GDP ratio remained constant all the way to 2009, although the actual value of the debt went up more than 100 billion, right? While this was happening, inside Greece, household income and household debt was massively exploding because, as I said, while this was happening, wages were either stagnant or they were being reduced. So a lot of people were borrowing. So you have like a massive amount of like increase in the household debt and a massive decrease in household saving. So people were basically surviving on this credit, more or less, right? That was the situation inside Greece. So then the question is, okay, the Greek debt did increase by more than 100 billion within that kind of bit less than a decade. Where did that money go, right? What did that money do? And that's the kind of one of the key things, because the main narrative about Greece is that, you know, they were like just giving out money to the public employees. They didn't even know how many public employees they had. You know, that was one of the things that Papandreou, the prime minister who brought Greece into the Troika, that's one of the things he proclaimed in April 2010. He came out publicly and said that we don't even know how many employees we employ, right? Which is kind of insane to say that, because all you had to do is like open your laptop, connect on the internet, and look at the data of the Ministry of Interior. That was it, you know. And the numbers were there. The IMF has the numbers, the OECD, all those data collecting kind of agencies have those numbers. But he had to say things like that in order to create this idea that, you know, the situation is out of control. I'm going to get back to that. But the question is, okay, so where did that money go? If we actually look at the total expenditure in Greece in that time, missing graphs, it is actually more or less constant, right? You don't have any massive like increases in the actual expenditure. No, in total government expenditure, public services expenditure, health expenditure, there's a slight increase in public order, right? But even that is kind of negligent. It's not really important. So if on the other hand, you have like a massive increase in the public debt, right? And at the same time, you don't see an increase in the spending, like, then the question is, okay, why did they need to borrow so much, right? And then the other thing one has to look is the revenue, like what was happening to the income of the state at the same time. And if you look at that, then you realize that the corporate tax towards profits of the corporate sector went down in that same period by 50%, right? While at the same time, household tax went up by 50%. So what you had, for example, in 2000, the tax in real euros for corporate profits was 5.6 billion, and by 2012 it was 2 billion, right? It was more than 50% increase. Whereas household taxation was 6.9 billion and it went up to 13.2. Now, household taxation is not going to give that much money to the state, right? So obviously what you had is a kind of collapse of revenue that had to be compensated by the fact that you had like low borrowing costs and you can like keep borrowing. So this was like the main reason. And this dramatic decrease in corporate profit taxation was not a Greek phenomenon, right? Again, I had a beautiful thing. Christine Lagarde from IMF tweeted yesterday, right, a graph that shows that corporate income tax rates have fallen significantly over the past 3 decades. And it has this graph, it's like really collapsing, right? So all over the world, that was the kind of the idea. You have credit expansion, everything's going to work fine, and then you can stop taxing all those rich people. So to conclude, the growth in the peripheral Eurozone countries during the golden years was a result of credit expansion facilitated by interest rates. Debt did increase, but with the exception of Greece, this was primarily private debt, not government debt. And when it did increase in the periphery, like Ireland and Spain and Portugal, it was in response to the governments bailing out the private sector. Greece was different, as I said, because of the bigger involvement of the state sector and because they had to compensate for the fact that their income was more or less collapsing. So now we get to the part of the crisis. What happened in 2010 and everything went to hell? Well, the key thing about what happened in 2010 is what happened a year and a half ago in the United States, right? That was the kind of trigger for the crisis on a worldwide level. And I'm not going to get into that at all, but like briefly to say there was massive exposure of the European banks into the real estate and collapse of the interbank lending in the United States. So in Europe, governments had to bail in their core banks who were failing because of the United States. Already in I think it was 2007 or 8, at some point in 8, I think Merkel had to go to parliament and ask for 600 billion or something like that. But what they realized very soon is that their exposure into Greece or like other peripheral countries was even bigger than that. Again, beautiful graph to show that. Germany had like more than 733 billion invested in peripheral countries, whereas France had more than 823 billion, right? So this is the situation in 2010, especially in the case of Greece, which at the time had a 300 billion debt, right? 80% of that belonged to foreign creditors. And this composition is quite crucial to understand what happens later on. And then the rest of the 20% belonged to Greek banks. So what, in 2010, knowing that there's going to be a terrible collapse in the banking sector and that they could not go back to parliament and ask for new money, they decided that there's a new way of like dealing with this. And Greece was going to be the first country in which they would try it. And that new plan essentially was that they're going to force a massive loan on Greece, right? They're going to gradually replace the composition of the creditors. So get rid of the exposure of the banks and replace it with official creditors like the IMF, the FSF, and the ECB, and force a very strict set of conditionalities for those loans, and then make sure that through these austerity measures, that loan that was given is going to be paid back. But the time of when it was going to be back, it didn't really matter. The urgent thing was to save the European banks, right, at the time. Now, it's crucial to keep in mind that they had full support in Greece about this plan, right? That was actually initiated in discussions between the PASOK and key officials and the IMF 6 months before they were even elected, right? And we know that because Strauss-Kahn came out at some point and said it because he thought it didn't matter anymore. So what you had in Greece is you had a government that was very eager to impose a number of measures and structure the economy in a way that is closer to the Northern European model, but they knew that they lacked the political will and the support to actually do that. So the idea for them was that if we manage to convince everyone that the situation in Greece is absolutely chaotic and that we're one step from, going to hell, and that we need help because of that, then we would not suffer the political cost, because it would be the IMF and the EU and all these people who are basically trying to help us, right? But even if it's going to be harsh austerity, which everyone thought more or less it was going to be, maybe they didn't know the extent, but that's what they thought. They thought that they could pass the blame to the foreigners, right, to the Troika. To create this kind of spectacle of absolute disaster, there were like two triggers that happened in late 2009 and early 2010 that have been largely forgotten, but they were quite crucial. The first one is that like every member state of the Eurozone is supposed to send report about their statistics twice a year, right, to the Eurostat. One in April and one in October. When October 2009, when the statistics were sent from Greece, the Eurostat said, well, there's something a bit funny about the statistics because they don't actually correspond to our projections of what would have been the deficit, blah, blah, blah. So the Greek statistical office came, okay, we're sorry, this is a bit of a mess. Give us a few months, give us until the end of the year, and then we will bring you the proper data. 2 days later, literally 2 days later, the PASOK government gets elected. Right? And 1 week later, the Eurostat receives new data, right? And even the Eurostat in its report is forced to add in a footnote that we were surprised to see that in a week, they managed to do what they needed like 3 months for, but they didn't, they didn't argue against it because suddenly the deficit in Greece from a 5.6, that was the original idea, was up at 12.4, right? Which was absolutely insane. 12.4 was like crazy. Eventually, a few months later, they updated it to 15.4, right? So that was like, everybody was like, because the deficit has this magic, nobody knows exactly what it is, but if it's too big, it sounds like bad. It means you're not doing things right. Now, the second thing that happened is something which kind of weird. It had to do with the bond market in Greece. It's a bit technical, but just very briefly, those of you who know how the bond markets work would understand. Essentially, the Central Bank of Greece allowed the naked short selling of Greek bonds for a period of 4 months, right? Basically it's like if you have I'm not going to explain it. It's just, let's put it this way. In different times and in different regimes, playing around with your government's bonds is considered high treason, right? Because you're fucking your economy, basically. You're basically allowing speculation to bring down the cost, bring down or massively raise the yields on the bonds. So you're basically speculating on the economy. And this is what happened. The Financial Times reported it at the time. This is not some kind of weird conspiracy thing. They didn't draw the conclusion that something was, but it had to be reported, right? And the Central Bank of Greece had to make an official response to that and say, that was kind of a technical mistake, but now we fixed it, the window is closed, that's it. In that time that the window was open to do like short selling of the Greek bonds, the yields went up. This is the time when everyone was saying, oh my God, the yields. So with all this insane situation and Papandreou coming out and saying that we don't even know how many employees we have, it was pretty clear that the situation was coming to a close and there was going to be an announcement for an official assistance from the European Union. And that's what they did. And that's when the first memorandum came to Greece in May 2010. Now, officially, the first memorandum was there to help Greeks, right, through loans, to stabilize its financial position with a set of conditionalities, of course, and to reduce the public debt and to restructure that awful Greek economy and all the pathogenies it has. Unofficially, of course, the aim was to save the French and German banks and their massive exposure. Austerity, in a sense, was unrelated to all that, right? It was an extra thing that was part of a larger plan of finally getting all these unruly kind of southern peripheral high spending states to come closer to the Maastricht Treaty, because they could not do that before. With such low borrowing costs, the state could just do whatever it wants, because it was still the Central Bank of Greece that was responsible for that. Now, at the time, that official aim was not particularly challenged by anyone, with the exception of Karl Otto Pöll, the ex-president of the Bundesbank, who came out in April 2010 and said, okay, this is a joke. The only purpose of the memorandum is to save Franco-German banks and rich Greeks, right? So he said it. Like today, the same thing has been said by other officials who are no longer in official positions. So Dijsselbloem, for example, the head of the Eurogroup, he came out a few months ago and said the same thing, that actually the first memorandum was about saving the French and German banks. At the time, if you said it, you were considered like insane and some kind of weird lefty. But at the time, it was, in this moment now, everyone comes out and says it. The program itself, the memorandum itself, was, again, in the words of the same people who designed it, but a few years later, was absolutely unprecedented in history. There hasn't been a record of such a hardcore fiscal contraction imposed in a country in such a short period of time. And comparing with situations like Mexico in the 80s and Argentina in 2000s, you did not have the same amount. The IMF itself, quote, said that this was an unusually strong front-loaded fiscal adjustment among the largest in recent history. The OECD wrote in 2011 that no other OECD country has achieved such a fiscal improvement in a single year over the past 3 decades. Just to make a short comparison, the amount of cuts that were asked from Greece in relation to GDP were 4.5, right? In the 3 decades that you had structural adjustment problems in Latin America, the average cuts that were being demanded were 1.6, right? In 3 decades, that was the average. In Greece, it was immediately 4.5. If you compare GDP cuts and austerity, you see, for example, Germany, the German austerity in 2003 and 4 was a 2% of GDP cut. Italy was 3, Portugal later on was 5.4, UK was 6.3, Spain was even bigger, 6.8, Ireland was quite strong at 9%. Greece was 18%. That was the amount of cut in GDP that was being demanded. Despite that insane program, they made all these projections that it's all going to go well, right? That was the idea. Again, a beautiful graph that shows every time the IMF did a review of how the program is going, how well is it going to go? And you see the actual GDP, and it's just insane. And of course, these people are not insane and they're not stupid, right? They knew that this was going to happen. Why they did it, I will explain later on. But in many ways, their official admission by all these people to explain that this was all in order to do to help the banks, made research like mine very irrelevant, right? Because now, for years we've been trying to say there's something really wrong about this, and then they come out and say, yeah, that was it actually. That was it, we don't care. But what they would never admit, of course, is what kind of consequences this thing had on Greece, for example. So very briefly, between 2010 and 2017, GDP contracted by 25.8%. This has never happened to a country which is not at war, right? Unemployment rose to 26% from 8%, and for young people, it was close to 65% for a good part of the decade. Public sector employees experienced a 40% reduction of their wages, almost half the money. So imagine from one day to another, you have half of what you had. Additional cuts were made with benefits. Private sector wages were also cut by 35%, but keep in mind that private sector wages were lower anyway to start with. Social insurance funds were decimated, especially in relation to the self-employed, because a lot of people withdrew. They could not pay them anymore, so there was no money. And later on, because of the restructuring of debt that happened, I'm going to explain later. Perhaps the most crushing thing happened in the health system, right? There was an almost immediate cut in the health budget of 35% in the first 3 years. So a great number of hospitals were closed down, especially in the countryside. Many health sector workers saw the avalanche coming and they decided to take early retirement, right? And at the same time, the memorandum of agreement had a proviso that said that you cannot hire new people in the public sector because there's so many of them, right? So what you had in the health system especially was a complete collapse because you had less people with 40% less wages doing the same work right? At the same time as like infrastructure and other like medicine and stuff being also collapsing, right? There was a lack of infrastructure, new machinery, or medicine. So this is what happened. And this is just the first memorandum, right? We're talking still in 2011, 10. So the question is, what did people do against that, right? Well, the social movement that emerged in this initial part of the austerity process was quite small in the beginning, right? Because, compared to what would come later. It basically consisted of the usual suspects, like left-wing parties, trade unions, anarchists, blah, blah, people who would like show up in demos anyway, right? Of course, there was a sense that something more important was happening. Just the mention of the IMF was kind of a shock for Greeks waking up on May 2nd or something and saying you're part of an IMF structural adjustment program. That was kind of a bit of shock. So it was kind of like building up. So by the third week after the memorandum was passed, there were already 3 general strikes, and the third one, on the 5th of May, had more than 250,000 people. This is quite big in Greece, although Greece has a tradition of like large demonstration. To compare, think of it this way, the December 2008 rebellion that had like massive worldwide coverage. The biggest demo during December 2008 was 40,000 people. Again, a big number, right? But not compared to 250,000 that was on the 5th of May. So that was a massive demonstration, loads of riots, but unfortunately, there was a terrible tragedy because 3 bank clerks were burned alive when a bank was torched by demonstrators. And that stopped everything for a while. Now, one key thing to understand why a lot of people did not participate in this initial stage was that a lot of people thought that the measures would not affect them, right? Because as I said, they were mainly targeting the public sector. So if you were not in the public sector, you felt that this was not going to immediately affect you. That was the official propaganda was that. Public sector employees, lazy, blah, blah, blah. We don't even know how many they are. Don't know. So a lot of people who were not in the public sector, and in Greece, especially if you're not in the public sector, you have a certain, there's a lot of schadenfreude kind of sense, oh, fuck them, because you really, people don't like the public sector that much. They consider them like the aristocracy of labor and stuff. And what they didn't realize at the same time is that the public sector is so key for the Greek economy that, of course, if the public sector goes down, the whole economy is going to be affected. But that was not very clear in the beginning. And what you also had in Greece was you had this traditional clientelist and very tight-knit system where people had the illusion that individually, through their connections to politicians and stuff like that, they could actually escape the consequences of the crisis. So for about a year, the first year, there was not a reaction, that would have been logical in terms of like the measures that were being enacted, right? But by 2011, it was becoming clear that this is not the case, that everyone is going to be affected. The collapse of the public sector trickles down to the whole economy. And as this realization was springing up, we had the explosions of the squares movement, the Syntagma Square occupation. Now, this movement brought together hundreds of thousands of people. It wasn't just in Athens, though the center was there in front of Parliament. It was all over. And one of the key characteristics of that was that it created and existed outside any pre-existing mediation, right? So political parties were not accepted in the squares, regardless of who they were. It wasn't just PASOK that was in government. Even Syriza, none of the parties were accepted. Trade unions were not accepted. The mass media were completely scorned and kicked out of the square. Instead, what you had is people getting together, organizing their own assemblies, trying to figure out what was happening and trying to have a proper discussion without any interruptions from experts or politicians about what they could do about it. So the whole mechanism that was holding the social cohesion of Greece for the whole post-war period was basically crumbling in front of your eyes, right? All the political parties, institutions, trade unions, mass media, everything was wrong. At the same time, there was no tolerance, regardless of what people have said afterwards, there was no tolerance of xenophobic or racist behaviors in the square, right? This is quite important to mention because a lot of people keep saying that this is where it started. It's absolutely nonsense. People who say that were basically not there. Of course, individually, you had hundreds of thousands of people Nobody knows what anyone has in mind. But whenever there was any kind of public or open expression or something like that, it was immediately, dealt with, let's say. Because 2 weeks before the Sinderma Square occupation started, there was a huge racist pogrom organized by Golden Dawn, the neo-Nazi group. And that had shaken a lot of people because they were basically running around the streets, beating and stabbing like migrants in the center of Athens without any consequences. So it was pretty clear to the people who mobilized around Sinderma, this is not going to be accepted. Golden Dawn itself told its members not to go to Sinderma, right? Now, the Sinderma Square thing lasted for about a month and a half. And in that time, it managed to call for 2 general strikes. Right? Again, we have this kind of important realization. It was people organizing themselves in assemblies who called for general strike. I mean, it's not trade unions mediating that, right? At the same time, after a lot of repression, on the 28th and 29th, a 2-day general strike in 2011, the police used 2 tons of tear gas in 2 days in this small space. I don't know if any one of you has been to Sinderma, but it's not that big. 2 tons of tear gas is quite a lot. So the police was absolutely brutal, and those in government, or at least the creditors and the Troika, were absolutely determined that they're not going to move back 1 inch. So the Sinderma Square was defeated, but what happened afterwards is that it was broken down into local. So it abandoned center stage in Sinderma. It stopped seeing the imposition of austerity as something that is a political decision that you can actually stop or not stop in parliament, right? And they tried to get organized in their own neighborhoods and in their own workplaces to stop austerity at its root, right? So, for example, there was a new law in 2011, which was a property tax, which was connected to the electricity bill. And that basically meant that if you did not pay that property tax, right? Again, home ownership in Greece is 80%. So when we're talking about property, we're not talking about rich people. More or less everyone in Greece owns their own place. So if you didn't pay the property tax, they would cut off your electricity, right? That was the idea. So what people did is they got together in groups and illegally reconnected electricity. They created non-payment campaigns against bus fare increases, against highway tolls, against all sorts of things. They created solidarity networks, free clinics. Quite crucially, as I said, the health system was collapsing, so it was absolutely necessary for people to have some kind of access to healthcare. And one of the things that they had done in healthcare is not only that the system was collapsing from within, that they had actually made it impossible for someone who was uninsured to go to get healthcare. Plus, you had to pay €5 to get in. There was a ticket in the hospital. You had to actually pay to get in the hospital. So people created free clinics and other forms of non-mediated solidarity campaigns. But there were some problems. I expand in the book. I expand more about the limitations, but I'm just going to briefly mention here a few things. I did say that there was a complete rejection of racist, xenophobic approaches, but at the same time, a large part of the movement, especially aided from the left, did adopt a national narrative, right? Maybe not nationalist, but national. So the idea that this is all something that has been imposed from the outside, and it's a question of national humiliation, and what you need to do in order to escape is to regain national sovereignty, was kind of gaining ground. Not as much as supporters of Grexit would have liked, but it did have. And that would be a major contradictions within the movement. The other thing was, of course, the fact that there were lots of concepts being thrown around, like direct democracy, participation, horizontalism, and all that. None of them were ever particularly defined, of course, because if you try to define that, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So what you had is a lot of people who were basically, acting under the illusion that just being somewhere is enough. Having moral superiority against, what they're trying to do against you would be enough to stop the austerity. Of course, it didn't, right? But what the movement up to that point did manage to do is to create a very deep crisis of legitimization, as I said, of existing political parties, politicians, trade unions, media, etc. it was becoming impossible, if you're part of the Greek establishment, to literally walk down the street in that time. In October 2011, there were just, if a politician, let alone a minister, was walking down the street, they would be attacked, beaten up, or have yogurt thrown at them. But it was impossible for them to be outside in the street. So under this pressure, the PASOK government basically collapsed. Papandreou decided to do a referendum. The Troika went insane when they heard that. They effectively sacked him immediately within a week. The referendum was cancelled. And the government was replaced by an interim technocratic government run by a guy called Papadimos, who was the ex-vice president of the ECB, surprisingly. The only purpose of that government, which was to last only for 5 months, was to pass the second memorandum, because it was also becoming clear that despite all these measures and the powerful things that they were doing, this would not be enough, right? Not in terms of austerity, there's never enough for austerity, but in terms of diminishing the exposure of European banks. So they needed a new loan agreement, along with, and this is what kind of important thing, with a so-called official debt restructuring. So even for the first 2 years, there was absolutely no discussion at all that the debt had to be restructured and reduced. Suddenly, all the official voices are calling for a debt restructuring, right? This was called the PSI agreement, private sector involvement. What was happening at the time was already from the various loans that Greece had been given, plus the ECB had created a securities market program, which was basically a way through which banks could exchange the toxic bonds that they had from Greece and get proper money from the ECB. And then those bonds would be packed at the ECB headquarters and never to be seen again. That already had diminished the exposure of European banks. At the same time, what the ECB created was this mechanism LTRO, which basically meant, in the case of Greece, that Greek banks started to massively buy the Greek government's bonds, right? So basically, they would receive money from the ECB to buy bonds. And what this created, basically, the ECB was concerned with minimizing the risk of contagion towards the rest of Europe. So what this created was the Greek banks were buying the government bonds. If Greece defaulted, it would be the Greek banks that would actually have to pay the price and not German and French ones. At the same time, by giving all this money to the Greek banks to buy government bonds, that created a situation where the Greek state was much more dependent on the Greek banking sector than it was before. So this is one of the processes of the transformation of the composition of the creditors, right? That was to be quite crucial in terms of how to deal with this situation. So on top of all of that, they come up with this PSI agreement, which basically was officially announced as a debt restructuring of 53%, the biggest debt restructuring ever to happen in history, right? That was absolute nonsense, right? None of that happened. What happened was you had a radical shift in the composition of the creditors. Again, beautiful graph to show that, but basically what happened is that when almost 70% of the outstanding debt was still owned by foreign banks in early 2012, within a month, that was completely transformed, and now 70% of Greek debt from February 2012 onwards was owned by official institutions, the IMF, the ECB, and the EFSF, a European kind of mechanism. So the massive exposure that was still a problem in terms of dealing with the crisis in Greece was completely replaced. The only people to lose from the PSI agreement were Greek pension funds that lost 22 billion because they were not even asked to be part of that, and small bondholders. And the decision at the Eurogroup was explicitly never to compensate them at all. The IMF itself, again in 2013, much later, wrote in an ex post valuation that private creditors were able to significantly reduce their exposure. There was a large-scale substitution from privately held to publicly held debt. This is the IMF itself. Now, although the idea was that there was going to be a 50% reduction of the Greek debt, it was actually not more than 20%. And within a year, it was back to huge numbers, to 320 billion. And the main reason for that is because along with the PSI agreement, where you also had a new massive loan of 130 billion, and most of that money went to the banks to recapitalize, right? Because they had lost money from the restructuring. So the Greek banks lost, for example, 27 billion in the restructuring. They had to exchange those bonds, right, and lose the money. And they got 48 billion in response immediately after. Summing up, as soon as the balance sheets of the core banks of the European countries were safe, and as soon as contagion from a possible default was secured, and the main reason that happened in the end was QE. When Draghi came out and announced QE and making sure to exclude Greece from that, he was basically signaling to everyone that even if Greece defaults, the ECB is here to buy whatever bonds is necessary to keep the system stable. So as soon as all these things were secured, and as soon as like the so-called handouts to Greece, like the loans, were utilized to secure all that, it did not matter what happened inside of Greece anymore, right? And that's the key thing. And this is one of the main reasons. I'm not sure like if one could even claim that the kind of general public understood that at the moment, but I don't think it's coincidental that that is the moment when the mass mobilizations against austerity stopped. It became clear in some way or another, whether through repression, whether through invariance or whatever, that this is just not going to stop. There's no way to stop this. And then the attitude from the Troika was also, like the risk of default was always mentioned, but it was clear that it was not the same risk anymore. And what mattered was the continuation of austerity and the gradual repayments of the debts that Greece received from the official creditors. Now, all this exposition should probably help a bit to create a kind of framework to understand how to look at Syriza coming to power in 2015, right? Because this is already it's 3 years later, after the end of all the movements, and after the fact that basically there was no longer any leverage to use as a potential contagious kind of force. You know, defaulting on Greek debt was not going to have the same consequences. This is something that I can say in retrospect, right? At the time, I didn't know that, but now it's pretty clear. And also that the Greek government, as I mentioned before, was completely reliant on the health of the banking sector, of its own banking sector. So the idea, you know, that this situation, this composition, this new composition of creditors, right, with official backing, who had a lot of time in their hands and had the ability to just like print money at whatever point in order to secure themselves against default. The idea that all of that could have been renegotiated, right, out of like goodwill or out of the moral outrage of the so-called humanitarian crisis in Greece is just absolute nonsense, right? The idea, you know, that you could just like, you know, Varoufakis, I mean, I have respect for him to a certain extent, but the idea that he would just go to the Eurogroup and explain to them like that they had the math wrong and that would change everything. It's just like complete misunderstanding of the whole thing and on the whole crisis and what it was about until that point. And basically what Syriza did as soon as they got elected is that they did a bit of back and forth for 6 months. Okay, they're the ones doing back and forth. The Troika didn't move at all. But they were like going back and forth, gradually kind of, you know, replacing all the so-called demands that they were going to have and eventually losing and humiliating and in a very kind of predictable way. In this context, I would say the fact that their program was completely stupid doesn't really matter, although it was, right? It didn't make any sense. If somebody reads the Thessaloniki program, that was the official manifesto of Syriza in 2014, September. Like the left wing of Syriza or the left wing critics of Syriza keep saying that Syriza betrayed the Thessaloniki program. That is that paved the way for their capitulation, right? If you actually look at the Thessaloniki program, it doesn't make any sense, right? It's not even a manifesto. It's basically saying we want all these good things to happen in Greece, and the way we're going to do it is because we're going to get into the quantitative easing program of the ECB, and then they're going to allow us for a bit of debt restructuring. So basically, you're negotiating on the basis of what they're going to give you, right? It didn't make any sense. So abandoning that doesn't make any sense either, because it was not up to you in the first place, right? You're not the one who decides whether you're going to enter QE or not. It's the ECB that decides. So, not getting into QE is not a betrayal of anyone. It's just a fact. What people did not expect, I think, in 2015, was the extent to which Syriza's capitulation would not only mean a continuation of austerity, but its extension, especially in sectors that had not been touched by another government before. So after Syriza, you had, for example, the initiation of auctioning and foreclosure of houses from people who could not pay their debt. Right? This is something that was specifically a law in 2010 that forbid, that. Especially because Greece, home ownership, 80%, we've said that. That is a very important hit, right, to people. And the Syriza government, under pressure from the ECB, because Greece has the Greek banks, although they're very powerful, they have a tremendous amount of non-performing loans, right? It's 45%, which is unprecedented. So under pressure from that, the government initiated the idea of taking away the house from people who could not pay their debt. During Syriza, the labor market has collapsed in a way that has become I don't know the best way to explain it. Part-time job today in Greece, and part-time means, for example, 6 hours a day, 4 times a week. You could get as much as 180 euros a month. That is your wage, right? When the crisis started, it was the generation of young people who were entering the labor market. The poor were called the 700 euro generation. In 2010, getting 700 euros was at the bottom of the scale. And now, with the part-time job, you could get 180 euros. But Syriza tells us that this labor market is growth-friendly, right? And because it's stabilized in a certain way, because there is actually a decrease in unemployment, precisely because you have an extension of jobs like that, part-time, low-paid, non-secure jobs. Taxation has remained incredibly high, right? It is literally a curse to own your own house in Greece anymore. And there's a whole set of privatizations going on, accelerated by the Syriza government, whose contracts can only be described, and I don't really use that term, but I will now. The contracts can only be described as colonial, right? You had the situation, for example, the 12 airports that were privatized, sold to the German Fraport company. They got 12 airports. They made a whole, contract which demanded that they inspected the airports before they were being sold in order to agree that they're in a good shape. And once they bought it, before they were even start functioning, they came back and said, actually, we don't think that they're in good shape. So they asked for 700 million to be returned to them as a kind of a punishment for the government. Before the airports were even opened up, they asked for more money than they were actually paying for leasing them, right, for every year. And they had another clause in the contract that said that if the company does not make its projected profits, right, then it will be compensated by the Greek state, right? Which is what? I thought the private market had some kind of. But anyway, so this is the situation. And of course, the Troika, for the first time since 2010, is absolutely ecstatic with this government, right? The first time, if you read the boring reports, technical reports they write every few months, it's the first time that they actually come out and say, wow, this is a fantastic government, right? These are the only governments that are not only implementing what we're telling them, but they go way beyond what has been agreed. So I'm closing now. I probably spoke too much. I would say, to start a discussion, there were two different sides to the Greek crisis. One was concerned about the debt and the bank exposure, and the other one was concerned with austerity. They were not directly related to each other. If one focuses on the first, right, which means looking at the debt, the sustainability, how much money should we give or we shouldn't, blah, blah, blah. You're basically relying on the creditor's goodwill. And that historically has never worked, right? You're relying on government negotiations. You're relying on a number of things that are completely beyond your control. It's like, if the ECB imposes capital controls and shuts down all the banks in Greece, there's not much you can do about it. As a person, right? I'm not talking about as a central banker. But since we're not central bankers, this is a level beyond our, maybe not comprehension, but beyond our capacity. But austerity is a completely different thing, right? Austerity is something that is done to you directly. And this is something that you can actually react to. And this is, I would say, what happened, what was most interesting about social movements. Because it was threatened at that point where it was happening. Like the best chance we ever got for stopping what was happening was exactly there. It was exactly the moment when people ignored the official framework, the whole discussion about debt, sustainability, blah, 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 and they focused on their actual needs, right? And their needs were not within a framework of like a slightly better distribution of an existing kind of wealth, while at the same time keeping the same goals of like economic growth, productivity raise, competitiveness. This is like in a funny way, this is the plan of Brexit. Right? That was the whole idea of Brexit. Brexit was going to work perfectly for Greece because as soon as you regained national sovereignty, then you can actually make the economy more competitive. Right? That was the kind of plan behind it. I would say most people had no time for that. The whole idea, when you have to resort to empty concepts like national sovereignty, what the fuck does that even mean, right? It doesn't mean anything. You just say it as if, you use it as a slogan in order to convince people because you have nothing particularly to offer. But there was a lot of people who were putting the question differently. They were saying, okay, do we want to return to the way things were? Is that the best thing, the best option, to return to the way things were before the crisis? Or do we want to start thinking about, living completely different lives? And what would that mean? And that was a real question, right? Because even if you had Brexit, I'm just like skimming through the Brexit debate now, but the question is, okay, what kind of life do you need? What kind of life do you want after that? And that was the question that a lot of people tried to practically answer. And I think that was the only chance you had to stop this kind of ridiculous madness that was going on. But unfortunately, what won the day was the idea that, that a happy future is a thing of the past. It either belongs to the past or it's something that is not going to come back again. Thank you. I've been speaking for an hour, is that? Sorry. It would have been better with the graphs.
Did they invent the deficit figures when they were making the Euro stuff? Did they just magic them out of thin air?
Well, no, I mean, the 3% deficit figure was invented, but it wasn't in the Euro. It was invented in the early 80s in France. It was like it's a funny story. I have that in the book, actually. I think it's a great story. Some advisors of Mitterrand, when Mitterrand was forced to capitulate from his own Keynesian program and return to austerity, he appointed two of his advisors in the economics ministry to come up with a scientific way of explaining why they need to make cuts in the budget, right? And there's this fantastic explanation from the guy who was actually one of those two. He's openly saying that today. He's been interviewed by the FATS and he's not hiding it. He's proud of it. But he actually literally said they sat down for 3 days and trying to figure out what is the best way to make this kind of scientific rule. And they said, well, deficit is a great, since Keynes, deficit means you're spending more than you have. So that is a bad thing. So whatever comes with deficit is bad. And the result of any economist is to talk about GDP, right? No matter what you're talking about, if you add GDP, it sounds more, believable. So they decided to say, okay, we're gonna divide that, get the ratio between the deficit and the GDP. And the guy himself recognizes that it doesn't make any sense, right? Because deficit is like accumulated debt, right, from previous years that is going to be repaid in a number of years in the future. Comparing that amount, which is like so widely spread, to the output of a specific year It's like it involves a kind of temporal discontinuity that doesn't make any sense at all. But at the same time, it allowed them, it was more or less what they wanted to do, and it allowed them to do that. So ever since, it's considered, a magical number, but it's complete nonsense. They just got it out of their ass. And the guy who made it says it, it's not a mistake. It's not by chance. I think the 60% debt is also kind of a similar story. I think it's part of this research from Rogoff and what's her name, that has been completely discredited ever since. But, the idea if you have more than 6% debt, then, the economy, the finance is going to be in trouble. But that has been discredited. But it doesn't matter, right? All of that is just like a way of keeping fiscal discipline. It doesn't matter what the exact amount is. That's the kind of like ideology of contemporary economics.
I actually have several questions, but in the interest of fairness, I'm only going to ask two, and then maybe if there's time, I will ask the rest of I'm interested. So the first question is, when you said there was an increase in household debt, so I'm wondering how that relates to sort of unit labor costs and wages versus inflation. So the German economist Heiner Flesbeck, for example, he comments how since the inception of the euro, the southern European countries had sort of roughly 6% sort of unit labor cost inflation rise, so going up, and then the target was something like 2 to 2.5%. And France was roughly on that target, but it's debatable whether their figure is actually correct. And then Germany sort of undershot at, it's like 1% or something along those lines. For the reasons of, it's, we have to be competitive relative to China and so on. So I'm wondering, in terms of this household debt increase, is it the case that unit labor costs and wages, which are related but not the same, could they not keep up in terms of the inflation increase? And was this the reason why there was an increase in household debt? The second question is, in relation to employment rates, you said one of the previous Greek prime ministers, or the premier, or was it Papandreou, you mentioned, said he could not mention what the employment rate was. And is this because of the sort of shadow or black economy within Greece, where historically in Greece, because of its relationship to the Ottoman Empire, not paying your taxes is supposedly a sort of kind of a form of sort of patriotism. Would this be the reason why you can't get accurate employment figures? I mean, even the United States doesn't have accurate employment figures because the federal government stops counting your unemployed after 6 months, because that's when they stop paying the dole, basically.
Well, I'll start from the second one. Just to clarify, seems to be a bit of confusion. Papandreou didn't say that he didn't know what the employment rate was. He said we don't know how many public employees we have. How many people are in the public sector? That's all he said. He didn't say generally about the employment rate. I don't think anyone could have come out and say that we have exact figures on the employment rate, because it is, it's not as dramatic as you describe, but it is of course slightly difficult to, especially with such a developed self-employed sector in Greece, which is quite big. So the question of whether somebody's working or not in that time, unemployment, all these things are kind of relevant to a certain extent. Of course, the numbers they have are not completely off the charts, right? Again, this was kind of unrelated with taxation, right? Because precisely the only people who cannot evade taxes in Greece are public sector employees, right? Because their taxes are immediately deducted from their wage. So they are the only people who can actually, not pay their taxes. Other people can, of course. There were specific categories and professional categories in Greece that enjoyed very low taxation because of clientelist connections. Like taxi drivers, for example, would only be taxed for 1,000 euros a year, regardless of how much they worked. That was part of the deal that they had made. Private doctors, there were lawyers. There was a lot of categories that, of course, engaged in kind of illegal tax evasion. But at the same time, I would say if we want to talk about taxes, it's also important to look at the other side and look at like what kind of taxation was actually, first of all, the whole corporate profit taxation that was going down in that period, and also things like the shipping industry in Greece, which is like the second biggest in the world, right? But it is not taxed at all in Greece, right? So I'm not going to defend like a stupid taxi driver who doesn't give a fuck, and I'm not going to defend that, but I'm not going to say that that was the thing that kind of brought the economy down, for sure. I think that's the kind of the point. Inflation rates were not very high in Greece, similar to the whole of the Eurozone. It was like, I would say around 3% or less. At the same time, yes, I would say labor unit cost and wages were lower than that. So people compensated through debt. It wasn't a massive increase in debt because, as I said, no, I didn't say that, but actually maybe it's important to mention the kind of credit expansion that was happening was very much targeted, right? Because you needed a kind of growth, you needed a kind of like increase in the circulation and in prices, but in sectors that are not seen as inflation. So it's not going to be like basic commodities. So if you had, I'll give you an example just to make that clear. If you had like 20,000 euros in your bank, you could go to a bank and ask for a loan. If you wanted a loan for like buying a house, right, they would give you 300,000 euros in comparison to your 20,000. If you wanted like a car, they would give you 30,000 euros. If you wanted to go on holiday, they'd give you 1,000, right? So of course, the whole idea was that we are actually going to increase the money supply towards those sectors that are not recorded as inflation, right? Instead, they're recorded as growth. And that is why in Greece you had like 5-6% growth in that decade, close to China. I mean, it's insane. But that wasn't real growth, right? It was just basically, an increase in the money supply that was targeted in sectors that are when house prices go up, it's seen as growth. It's not inflation. That's just another weird thing of economics. So that's where the money went. I don't know if that answers your question at all.
Just to follow up. So when you said so from 2010 the low wages was about 700 euros and it dropped to 180. In terms of inflation for the type of commodities that not housing or cars or anything like this, did the prices actually drop or did they stay the same level and then people only had 180 euros?
Well, again, depends on what kind of like goods or services we're talking about. In some cases they did. In some cases they did. The prices did drop. Not to the extent that somebody could survive with 180, right? Obviously. Most people moved back to live with their families. That was that kind of movement. And of course, like consumption and aggregate demand was like completely decimated. Like 35% of enterprises closed down in the first 5 years of the crisis. So there was a collapse in that sense. Is that an answer?
First of all, simple factual question. Can you summarize this shift in the structure of credit history? Because I was a bit lost. Like on the one hand, it's a shift from foreign private banks to institutions via the Troika.
Yeah.
But then you also mentioned something, this is...
the Greek banks.
Yeah. Is that like a chronological thing?
Well, yeah. It was more or less happening at the same time. Okay, from the beginning, from 2010 onwards, there was a constant attempt to like reduce the exposure of like French and German banks primarily, right? They were the main holders of debt. So there was a whole process. Part of it was like through the loans, part of it was them dumping like their toxic bonds to the ECB and other kind of things, or selling them. That was happening, but it wasn't like, until 2012, when you had the PSI agreement, it wasn't complete yet, right? Around 2011, So again, more or less from the beginning, the ECB had this program, was called the Security Market Market Program, which basically was a way through which German, French banks could dump their toxic bonds, Greek bonds, right, and get money in return. So they would reduce their exposure. What happened in 2011 was a transformation. This is the thing with the Greek banks. The ECB created a mechanism called the LTRO, which basically allowed, they gave money to Greek banks at extremely low interest rates, right? If you think of the loans that they were giving to Greece through the official thing was like a 4 or 5% interest rate in the beginning. Greek banks would receive loans from the ECB at 1% interest rate, with which they were directed to buy Greek bonds, Greek government bonds, right? And what the ECB was trying to do was to say, okay, if default happens,
like new bonds, newly issued bonds.
Sorry?
Newly issued bonds, or
yeah, newly issued, yeah. Or maybe like T-bills, or it kind of depended. It would also be older bonds as well. They could be exchanged. But the key point was to transfer the kind of possibility of default towards the Greek banking sector and away from the French and German, mostly. That was the kind of thing.
And that's my follow-up question.
Yeah.
No, because it seems that in your reading of the whole crisis, the urge to save German and French banks is key, right? So how does that differ from a national narrative that you mentioned critically when you talked about the limits of the movement in Greece, where you said one problem was that even though they weren't xenophobic or racist, they basically had a national reading of the crisis as something imposed on Greece from whatever foreign institute. So in your reading, I think there is I'm not saying you're a nationalist, I'm not consistently anti-nationalist, but it also seems that foreign interests, basically, to save German banks, French banks, is quite important in your whole reading of the thing. That's my first question. Secondly, dozens of questions, but I'll limit myself to a few. Do you see any link between the deep shit in which Greece is now and something I would describe, and you in fact, and your book do it as well, those were the parts I liked most in your book when you were describing the consecutive different attempts by Greek governments to get something going that vaguely resembles proper modern capital accumulation, right? And you describe this as a total failure. Also, I would say when they lower corporate tax, for example, right? It's an attempt to get capital accumulation going. Whether it works or not is another matter, but that's the idea behind it. And it seems to me there is something slightly contradictory, at least if I understood your book correctly, in your whole narrative, is that on the one hand, you describe this underlying weakness of Greek capitalism. At the same time, from a more political point of view, like whenever someone makes a link between this deep shit now and this underlying weakness, you kind of tend to say, well, that's propaganda, that's ideological, that's basically blaming the Greeks themselves for their misery, whereas you focus on austerity politics. You know what I'm getting at? It's a bit like kind of. And since I fundamentally oppose the whole capitalist mode of production, it's not blaming Greeks. When I simply point out, well, in Greece, proper modern capitalism never really developed, because it had already developed in France, Germany, etc., etc. So markets were basically, it's kind of like the tragedy of the latecomer. It's kind of difficult, you would have to be ultra protectionist and very lucky with world market constellations to get whatever, like a metal industry, car industry, and modern sectors of production going once you already have these, all these well-established capitalist hothouses in Europe. And so that's what kind of makes me feel a bit uneasy, and what's maybe a reason why this, initiative here with the awful name, Europe can't be a point of reference if you think in cosmopolitan, internationalist categories. Where it's all about expertise, Keynesian ideas, that the solution to all our problems is just the state spending more money. I think in some sense it's not a coincidence that you, as a radical, anti-capitalist, anti-state person, are invited by basically social democratic initiative. Because you have this kind of bias in your reading, which is, in a very subtle way, can be read as left Keynesian. And too much focusing on policies and not so much focusing on the limits of capital accumulation. That's my critique in a nutshell.
Okay, but I mean, long discussion. I would kind of reverse and say, how does pointing the fact that Greece was not economically developed help in understanding what's happened today? I mean, you can say that and it's a fact, but from then on, how does it explain, what Greece did in the Eurozone? How does it explain what happened in 2010? I mean, in a certain way, you can just say one paragraph and say, just a sentence, well, Greece was not economically developed and that's what they got. Which is basically, I would reverse the kind of criticism and say this is exactly what Germany is saying, right?
I know.
Yeah. So I don't.
There's a kernel of truth if you.
Yeah, there's a kernel of truth in both cases, but I don't see how you get from one point to the other. And it's kind of related to the question before. It's like, I mean, the fact that French and German banks were like extremely exposed in Greece is just undeniable. That doesn't mean, right, that the response to that should be national kind of pride. I don't understand what the connection you made there. I mean, pointing at the fact that that was at stake, right? These were the structural forces that were, at the time battling for dealing with the crisis as it had happened, does not mean, or at least I don't understand the link, like does not mean that the response to that is like nationally based. Like it's just pointing at the obvious, right? And of course, if I had only talked about like French and German banks, that would have been perhaps more understandable. But if at the same time, I think I made it clear that the whole plan of like how to recreate or restructure the economy and make it competitive, whatever, was entirely shared by the Greek elites, right? That was like simultaneous. Like they were either wishing to emulate exactly the conditions that they have in Germany or bring the Greek economy as close to that model as possible. And that was like, that was done by Greeks. And for me, that is the kind of basis of saying that a national narrative doesn't make any sense because it was not simply foreigners that you were fighting against, but you were fighting against the whole idea of how to organize modern life. The fact that it happened in this case, for historical reasons, obviously, that German and French banks were at the top of that pyramid of like credit expansion is just, it's just a fact. You cannot deny it, right? You cannot deny it. But it doesn't lead me, at least, to the conclusions that you seem to imply.
No, I'm not saying you're drawing back nationalist political conclusions. I'm just saying the way you interpret the chronology of the crisis is kind of compatible with what they're saying, and maybe they're right. But I think
who's saying?
People around Syntacon basically read the crisis in a national framework.
Excuse me for one moment. We're here in a dialogue. Is
Yeah,
something we don't want. There's other questions, please.
I'll shut up. I'll see him anyway all the time. But if no one else says something...
Oh, sorry, yeah.
I have a question. Why do you have a reason why the demonstrations did not went on? Did the people could not see, or was the propaganda by the Greek government so good? One reason. For me, it's possible that the community of the normal living people in Greek was so good that they helped each other and they could overcome this situation. Second question would be, do you have a reason why in main German and French, I think French was more, banks hold Greek.
That?
Yes.
You mean why French and German and not Dutch or something?
Yes.
Right. Well, What demonstrations, I think the mass mobilization, let's put it that way, stopped for a variety of reasons. I would say demonstrations themselves, I think a lot of people were at the same time scared to a certain extent, right? It was becoming extremely violent after a certain point, and it was kind of hard to deal with that violence. I think there were more than 500 people injured on the 29th of June in Sindama Square. And of course, there was a kind of development of people like fighting back against that, but it does create a very kind of tense atmosphere. And the second thing, which is equally important, is that the fact that people could not afford to do general strikes and demos anymore. And in terms of like general strikes means you lose money. In the first 2 years, between 2010 and 12, there were 18 or 19 general strikes. If people are going to strike all the time, you know, in a situation where the wages are being cut and stuff, it just became unviable to continue in that way. So that's why one of the reasons that it was like transformed from a center stage, Sindama type mobilizations towards a more local thing, because that could have been, that would have made it easier for people to participate without having to sacrifice either their bodies or, I don't know, their money or whatever, you know. So I think these were like important reasons. Plus, I think the fact that at the end of the day, they realized that these kind of forms might not have helped so much. The determination on the other side from the Greek government, successive Greek governments and the creditors to proceed no matter what, kind of made people realize after 2 years. I mean, we're talking about almost 2.5 years of people constantly being on the street and without any result. I mean, people didn't get 50 euros back from their wage cuts in those 2.5 years. And then the type of like mobilizations were unprecedented for like Europe in general, if not for wider kind of geographical space. It's kind of, it's disheartening in a way when you do that for such a long time and you see that there's no immediate result. I think what people were up against was just to, and at the end of the day, okay, there's another two kind of, it didn't just depend on Greeks, right? If there was not something happening at the same time in other countries and practically connect the two things, not trade unions like randomly and abstractly talking about, you know, solidarity with the Greek South, whatever, nobody cares about that. But if there was some kind of different form of networking and organization between working people and those affected, maybe things would have been different, but that never happened. And one of the reasons it never happened was precisely large parts of the left adopted this national narrative attitude, which was basically, you know, Greeks are being humiliated by the Germans. And that was the end of it. So there was no particular attempt to go beyond that and create a more international network. I would say these are like some of the reasons that I would say the demonstration stops. Why French and German? Historically, I mean, Germany has a very productive economy, has a lot of surplus. It is always afraid of like importing inflation from all the money that it makes from its exports, and it's interested in exporting that money.
I think they had, for example, Germany and also French, they all had a debt by their own. So how could this go on?
Government debt, you mean? Government debt. Yeah, but it's like private banks who are doing the kind of expansion. They're not directly affected by that. And even the government debt in Germany was not that big. I mean, in terms of official, you know, targets of Maastricht and stuff, it was just beyond 6%. And I think after a while it went down because Germany kind of benefited from the fact that there was this instability on the euro for all this time. There's been research that shows that there's a lot of money returning to Germany precisely because they're looking for safe assets, and that brings interest rates down. So they've saved, apparently, one researcher has more than 100 billion in interest payments in those years because of that. I would say, yeah, it's just historically, for reasons that we can debate forever, Germany has a strong economy. France has a very developed banking sector. They were the biggest players in that game. Why exactly wasn't the Dutch? I don't know. Could have been the Dutch. The Dutch were also somehow exposed. Japan had like a few billion, other countries too, but they were the biggest one.
German and French banks involved.
I mean, that's the data. I mean, as I said, it was like 730 billion for Germany and 840 billion for France. That was the exposure they had in the peripheral states. The next country that had a big exposure was something around 40 billion or something.
May I add to this? It has something to do with the trade position of these countries, because Japan, Germany, these are countries which have heavily external trade, and this is part of it, that their banks give the credits. And especially the French and the German banks were very hawkish, and they were also very engaged in the American financial crisis. So they played a big part. And we don't have to forget that the interest rates for loans in Greece were relatively higher than mid-Europe. So their hawkish position, their relation with trade, because they were exporting a lot, is maybe an explanation for your question.
Please,
But
yeah.
I have some.
Yeah.
It's one of the back econs.
Beer?
There's a young lady in the back.
Yeah.
Forever.
So-
Doesn't manage to raise that hand high.
Thank you for, yeah, please. I'm not.
Actually, if I got you right, the essence is that you point out debt and household stability on one side is to be separated from austerity on the other hand. So actually, there is this separation, and to whom are you speaking? Are you speaking to the politicians in Greece who agreed to the treaties with the Troika, or are you speaking to the Troika actually demanding this kind of programs of austerity? So, to whom is this a part of separating those two things directed?
Well, I use it as an analytical tool. It's not exactly directed. It's more like saying the structure of the programs that were imposed, the austerity programs, made it very clear to anyone who wanted to see it that it would not make the economy better, and it would not bring Greece in a position to actually pay its debt. So that thing in itself for me means that there's a separation between the two. One thing is the debt, and one thing is austerity. Because like those two together, the official thing was to say, okay, through austerity, the economy is going to get better, it's going to be whatever, and then they can repay, and debt is going to be reduced. I mean, clearly it didn't work, but I think it was pretty obvious that it wouldn't have worked. It couldn't have worked, right? So, assuming they're not insane, I think they knew that, and they themselves had the separation. There's one thing to make sure that the debt remains the kind of constant leverage through which we impose austerity, but it is not actually paid, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't.
But if this is so obviously, then there must be on a political level, there must be other reasons why this was done, from both sides. And I'm actually interested in those political reasons. So if I, cheers.
Sorry. Sorry, I was just.
If I did I got it correctly, then you said that the intention of the political actors in Greece was to establish like neoliberalism reforms, with having the opportunity to blame the Troika, and the other hand, so the Troika, it was just like everyday business. We want to strengthen neoliberalism reforms. Question mark.
I don't know if neoliberalism is the best term to explain that, because I think in a certain way when we have to clarify what we mean exactly, but even in the most conventional way of understanding it, I would say the governments in Greece were neoliberal even before the crisis. So I wouldn't make that the key point, but at the same time, I would say, yes, there was a whole number of things that the PASOK government of 2009 wanted to change, that they felt that they could not do it, either because there was going to be a lot of reaction in Greece or because within the same party, as I said, there were very strong clientelist relationships. A lot of people, MPs, got elected because they had direct connections to people. If they had to impose on that, there would have been some kind of internal revolt. And there was eventually, right? PASOK, which is like the state mechanism of Greece, is not a political party. PASOK ruled Greece for 30 years, since 1981. They do not exist anymore. This is like unprecedented kind of changes. This is like the party that formed like post-dictatorship Greece, and it doesn't exist anymore. So they paid a price. And that was kind of the price that they paid. At the same time, on a general level, I would say, yes, of course, the whole idea from, European officials, the Eurogroup, the key actors, or whoever is to impose those kind of like restructuring, use the fact that you have one currency in order to impose internal devaluation when things go wrong. Make it constitutionally impossible to have like fiscal spending. That is the kind of the whole direction, and that's pretty clear. So I would say the crisis in Greece was an opportunity for them to do that, right? Even though that wasn't like the main, or at least that wasn't just the only reason it happened. It happened on the one hand for the massive exposure that was happening after the collapse of 2007 and 8, and then that was a good opportunity. Because I would say, if I'm allowed to expand a little bit, I would say during the whole Eurozone golden years, it was not possible to impose that kind of discipline, right? Precisely because there was still some kind of control. Greece was still in markets. They could still continue borrowing. They couldn't change interest rates for the whole of the Eurozone just because Greece wasn't spending them the way they would have liked them to. But as soon as 2010 happens and everything goes to hell, they have the fantastic opportunity because it's like Greece is out of the markets. So you get someone out of the markets, they cannot borrow anymore. The only chance they have in order to fulfill whatever it is they want as a government is to accept a massive loan from somebody else. So that was kind of a good opportunity, I would say, for them. Yeah.
Is there like a long-term goal by the Greek government or by the international institutions of what they want Greece to be on that in the gold market? Or, if it doesn't help Greece repay its loans, then there has to be some other reason for austerity, doesn't there?
Yeah, is it a fetish actually?
Sorry?
Yeah.
I didn't hear that, sorry.
It's a fetish.
Fetish.
Can I just add a question to Pascal's?
Yeah.
Like you said that it was clear from the very beginning that austerity would fail, it would not create the results, the official ones, but it would create a recession. Would you say this was also clear to those parts of the Greek bourgeoisie that supported austerity? They want to fuck up their own national economy.
No, but that's the thing. Okay, so I'm going to try and answer those three at the same. I would say that the Greek elites, or at least part of the Greek bourgeoisie that was kind of engaged in that project in the beginning, did not have an understanding of how far the austerity would go. I would say, in a certain sense, nobody expected that much. I think everyone knew more or less that it's going to be harsh, but nobody expected like the actual thing that happened, because I think there was a lot of like okay, I don't want to focus on that, but everyone knew it was going to happen, but different interests had different ways of measuring how bad that it would be. For the Greeks, I think their idea was there was going to be some kind of austerity, not very harsh, but that would allow them to do certain things that could eventually bring Greece in an economical way closer to the model of like Northern Europe. I don't know why they thought that. It doesn't make any sense that they could do that. But that's essentially what they thought. Because in a certain way, the dominant model at the time was, this is how you create a strong economy. You focus on export, you reduce like your wages inside, you don't have like so many benefits. That was the kind of idea that more or less everyone agreed to at the top level. So everyone was trying to imitate that. But at the same time, I think there's an extra element in relation to Greece, which is kind of like maybe not as clear from what I said so far, is that Greece was like 2% of GDP, Eurozone GDP. So basically more or less irrelevant in terms of trade, in terms of like actual production output and everything like that, for reasons that, again, are historical. So I would say at the end of the day, it didn't matter whether Greece was going to go down like that. I think the key point was to secure that there was going to be no contagion, but at the same time, at some point there was some plan, that some things were discussed, like, okay, Greece, with all this like massive reduction in wages and labor unit costs and all that, they might be able to compete with Balkan countries, right, who have like similar wage levels. So that would be like one way for Greece, because they're never going to compete with Germany, and they wouldn't want them to compete with Germany anyway, despite the fact that it's impossible anyway. So one of the idea could have been, that. But I would say the key thing is like that hasn't happened either, right? But they don't care. I think that's the point. They don't really care, to the extent that it doesn't create any kind of problem, of like threatening the whole currency, which it doesn't anymore. It doesn't matter whether the economy is going to be like, it's just, I would say economists who are looking at this project, right, looking at this, okay, like, before 2000, Greece was like here, and then the Eurozone, it went like here, growth, and now it's collapsing again. To the extent that this collapse is not like much, much lower than what it was before, they consider it just like a kind of like balancing out. They don't think that this is like a particularly, they look at like places like Eastern Europe and stuff that have experienced much more long-term, okay, not very sudden, but like long-term kind of depreciation and devaluations and stuff. And they consider that to be, that is still sustainable, So why would they care about whether Greece is like able to rebound? And at the end of the day, rebounds in what way? To do what exactly, Who's Greece going to compete with? If you take out the credit, right, that created the growth in that decade, what does Greece have? Tourism, export.
But at the same time, if the austerity doesn't help Greece repay its loans, is that irrelevant to saving German French pays?
Austerity?
Yeah.
I would say, yeah, that's my point. Austerity was basically the condition attached to the loans that were given in order to repay, the French banks. So you have that, but then the loans that were given had like a maturity rate. Greece is going to like, literally, they're going to finish paying off the loans that they got in these three memorandums in 2059, right? This is the kind of like, this is how long it's going to take. And, these are institutionally protected. Like the ECB cannot even, is not even allowed legally to write losses in its balance sheet. It could just print more money. So they're kind of like safe in that sense, and to the extent that, Greece has been forced to produce like surplus budgets since 2-3 years ago, they started. And they've committed to producing like 3.5 surpluses every year for the next 8 years. Again, no country in the world has ever made that, but, they think Greece will. That means they keep paying, what they need to. But there's not an immediate danger, right? I think that was what I was trying to say with the change in the composition of the creditors. There's no immediate kind of threat.
May I just ask you for political method to sell? Sorry, but all the same people are talking.
Yes, sir.
The second round. So I just wanted to add that austerity is inherent in the system of the euro. It's not an accident. It's just part of internal devaluation, which the euro brings with it. So it's completely, it's adequate to the system's logic. Of course, there are political reasons why at this specific point of time it was implemented or enabled for implementation for reasons you elaborated on, like that in Germany and French parliaments, these loans have somehow legitimized and so on. I will not go into more detail. First of all, I'm sorry for coming late. and I enjoyed your presentation despite the missing figures.
Would have been better. Would have been
I
better.
haven't read your book, but I really like how you describe the build-up from the global recession to how the social movements came up as a reaction of the stuck of the political system, and how you describe it with the macroeconomic data, which reminds me of a lot of similarities in Turkey. They had also this boom where they had very low interest foreign exchange, foreign loans, and then they had in 2013 this Gezi protest, and there were a lot of economic reasons, but they were not so discussed so much. So it reminded me a lot of this one. So thank you for this, Pavlos. I have just one question. It's mixed a little bit with a comment. You describe, or I get a bit, idea of how the left was positioned within the series. You said that there was a Panke's position. I think he was not so naive, just believing he could somehow change the minds of the Eurogroup. He had also some other plans.
Yes, yeah, he had.
But then we have the Lapavitsa's position, Brexit from the left perspective. I don't know the Thessaloniki program, but I think the Lapavitsa's perspective was not just let's wait and see whether they will take us into the QE or not. So this was new for me. And then, of course, there's the Tsipras, we can call mainstream. I have a lot of questions on this because you opened, you ended with a question what to do, of course, from a left perspective, but I think we cannot, it would be a too long discussion. So, thank you for your presentation.
Welcome. You're welcome. But so the question is about the kind of left series, or what's the kind of distinction?
Where do you? Because you said people should, of course, this is an anarchist position to let's try to stop and think whether we can try something else in how to organize life, and you gave some examples and so. But from the policy perspective, of course, you think of the macro level. So this is not direct to you, but I think also I know a lot of Marxists who say yes, economic policy is Keynesian policy, and so I don't really think it's helpful to just somehow put like Keynesian policies as a evil thing. I don't think this is really helping. If you want to analyze and have a stake in making economic policy, you can of course say, okay, this is very mainstream, and then I will want to do something else. But this is another debate. This is just a comment on it. Because at the end, your position for me was not so clear. Where to?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That's why it's not clear. Like, how could I know what we should do? I'm just being honest. I mean, I think anyone who claims that they do know, and that's my problem with Keynesians, for example, is just wrong. You know, I think what I try to kind of explain in a way in the talk and in the book as well is that. For me, if there's any possibility of change, it lies within social movements. It lies within the development of struggles and the kind of relationships that these create that force people to kind of rethink a whole number of things. When you focus too much on policy, then you confine yourself within a framework that is not of your making and which is already kind of limited. I think that's my kind of general point. Varoufakis has a lot of like interesting things to say, and he did have an extra plan, and it's kind of smart in a certain way. But at the same time, he accepts too much of this world to expect something to change from within. I mean, it's not by chance that Varoufakis, ended up in the first week to say that 70% of the austerity was okay. Right? It wasn't just a negotiating trick. I think he did actually believe that. If you read his books, I mean, he does say privatizations are good, whatever helps the fiscal situation of the country. He has these kind of ideas. And I'm not saying that to say he's like the demon or something, but it's just to point out that the more, within this framework you operate, the more you're forced to accept the limitations that it poses, some of which I would say are completely, made up, like the 3% deficit, this idea of competitiveness, making the economy grow. These are things that are not, it's not what's going to make people, live better lives. That was kind of, but I don't know, what else to do. We'll have to get together and talk about it. I guess that's part of what we're doing today.
Right, and we'll stop here. The thing is, I don't know if you have time. We normally go out for something to drink, something to eat. Everyone's invited to come along if you want this. Do you want to do this?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, then you come along and ask Pavlos what you want. For those who would like a book, and it really is worth reading, they're €10. In the back, you can buy one. The last thing I wanted to say with regard to your question, because I think it's very interesting, what's coming next week, is in Italy, you really have the bourgeoisie, then a classical neoliberal definition said, let's join the euro because then we can more or less dump the whole political system in Italy, because then the Germans will tell us how to run our country. And that's why, and there's even a word for this in Italian, which is escaping me at this moment, but Andrea will tell you about this. But there was really the strategy, how to get, to stop the popular movements, to stop any interference in the economic process by Italian governments or Italian movements or unions or whatever. So that's, I think, in a way, we're going to be able to connect to tonight's discussion. That's next, what did I say, Wednesday, the 20th at 7 p.m. here. So I can just thank you for coming and hope to see you again. And that's it.